Now, on this International Women's Day, we recognize the profound resilience of African women who stand as the primary shock absorbers for society's greatest challenges. Now, for example, in South Africa, where femicide rates are nearly 5 times the global average, women are reclaiming their power by mastering self-defense and martial arts, transforming from victims into survivors who refuse to be defined by fear. Beyond physical safety, women across the continent are disproportionately bearing the weight of energy, colonialism, and national debt as governments cut fundings for healthcare and education to repay loans. It is women's unpaid labor and community leadership that fill the gap, protecting families from the compounding effects of either climate change and resource extraction. But ultimately, African women are demanding a world that values their lives as much as their labor. We celebrate their courage today by acknowledging that they're not just victims of systemic injustice, but the essential architects of a more secure, equitable, and sustainable future. Now joining us on the conversation, we have Cameron Kasambala, spokesperson for Women for Change in Johannesburg, South Africa. And we will be having Mary Ikoku, founding president, Emerge Women Development Initiative in Abuja, and also Ruqayyatu Imam, president, Medical Women Association of Nigeria, Borno Chapter. But for now, we only have Cameron. So thank you so much for your time, Cameron, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So to begin with, a recent report by the Tax Justice Network argues that African women function as a hidden subsidy for national debt, with $163 billion spent annually on interest instead of health care. So how do we move the conversation from poverty to economic theft, given that women's unpaid labor is literally balancing the books of debt-ridden states?
I think that's a very interesting question. And while I'm not an expert on debt, I think the reality is women continue to be consistently overlooked when it comes to economic empowerment and investment. So there's not a lot of investment and time being put into empowering women and providing financial incentive for women to do the work that they're doing. So we're doing this labor and we're getting no rewards, we're not benefiting from it. And I think people don't realize how much it costs as well. So when people speak about gender-based violence, femicide, for example, people don't realize that there are unspoken costs to the country itself because of GBV. We think about loss of income, medical bills, infrastructure issues. So there's a lot of, I think, issues that come for women that I don't think people really are aware of. And I think that it's so important that we educate people about these unseen debts, because the less that people know about it, the less work and initiatives that are taken into fixing it.
All right, now we've talked about debts. Now let's talk about, climate change, renewable energy, because according to reports, Africa holds 40% of global renewable energy potential, but receives less than 2% of global investment. This has actually been an issue for so long. So how does that actually trap rural women, like for example, in a cycle of energy poverty, forcing them into hazardous fossil fuel extraction zones just to sustain their livelihoods? Because if you look at it, a lot of women, especially in Africa, in rural areas, cannot even afford gas. So, what they do is they use charcoal, firewood, which is hazardous for their health. So speak to us.
I think the first thing is that the government's responsibility to invest in the well-being of its citizens can often be I almost want to say neglected, because we have the government focusing on paying foreign debts and spending all this money instead of investing it in healthcare, education, infrastructure. And what happens is when all these things are coming about, women continue to be almost like the shock absorbers of what's going on in the rest of the world. And so when you speak about, fossil fuels and the damage it's causing, there's a lot of displacement that happens the more we invest in these kind of fossil fuel projects, and the displacement itself, like you said, puts these women in very dangerous situations and unsafe environments. And not only that, because there's no economic empowerment, women don't have the accessibility and affordability to be able to then invest in safety precautions to keep themselves safe. So you mentioned charcoal and having to use certain gasolines that are very dangerous for their health, but when you have no alternative, it's kind of nothing else for you to do. And I think that's why there's so much conversation. We always bring it back to the government, but there's a reason. It's because the government's choice of where to allocate their funds and where to invest their funding plays a major factor in the safety and well-being of women, of their families, and the community as a whole. Because women make up over 50% of the population in most countries, and women are not just looking after themselves; they're looking after their families, communities. Often, we're the caregivers and takers of many other families. So we deal with a lot.
All right. So I'm told that Mary Ikoku has joined us. Thank you so much for joining us, Mary. Well, if you can hear me, let's move to South Africa, where, femicide is 5 times the global average. We're hearing reports that women are turning to paramilitary-style self-defense. Now, speak to us. Does the rise of, this defense or lone operator shooting ranges exactly for women signal a terminal lack of faith in the state's ability to uphold or even save the woman or protect the woman and uphold the most basic right to life? Mary? All right, we have been unable to reconnect. Cameron, did you get my question?
I did, and it's
right,
an interesting conversation because within South Africa, actually, we have a lot of organizations where women are holding women's only shooting ranges or specific classes and training for women. And I think what it speaks to is kind of a twofold issue. We have the autonomy and empowerment of women coming in and feeling that they can take charge and protect themselves, which is so valuable, I think, in this time that women should be able to defend themselves. But it also speaks to a sign of failure on the other side, because it's almost as if, as victims, we must be these vigilantes protecting ourselves, and looking to protect our own safety, because we are our own first responders, we do what the system cannot do for us. And I think that's a twofold conversation. So while, yes, it's empowering to see women constantly, reaffirming and protecting ourselves, and it's so valuable that we do it, it's really highlighting and indicative of the state of the countries that we're in, because for women to have to take such level of initiative, even military level, learning how to use weaponry to protect themselves, speaks to the culture and the environment that they're existing in.
All right, so I'm told, Mary, you can hear me? Or is it Ruqayya? All right, let's talk to Mary. Mary, let's hear your thoughts. I'm sure you've heard what we have been discussing. We just talked about South Africa and how women have to resort to paramilitary-style defense to defend themselves from femicide. Now, South Africa has also declared gender-based violence and femicide a national disaster, yet we're seeing nearly 40% of the allocated 57.2 billion rand remains unspent. So speak to us on your thoughts of this and why you think the bureaucracy of the state is proving more lethal than the lack of funds itself. Mary? Ruqayyah, can you hear me? I think we only have Cameron now. So Cameron, please, let's have your thoughts.
Can you reframe your question a bit?
All right, so I was talking about South Africa declaring gender-based violence and femicide a national disaster, and only 40% of the allocated 57.2 billion rand, remains unspent. So would love to hear your thoughts on the declaration and why you think that bureaucracy of the state is proving more lethal than the lack of funds itself.
Oh, I think the biggest hurdle that we face once again is the plan is fantastic, the implementation is not. And whilst there's alleged use of funding, what we continue to not see is the clarity. So your auditing, your reports, clear breakdowns on exactly where funding is being spent, because the reality is the conversations are good. This classification was an important step because it acknowledges the magnitude of the issue. But what it doesn't do is tell us what the government is practically doing to tackle gender-based violence and femicide. And I think yes, there's money in place, but there's no point having money if money is not being utilized effectively and efficiently and investing in important, infrastructure. For example, we have Tutuzela care centers in South Africa, and these are supposed to be centers that offer counseling, legal, and medical supports for victims in one specific space, but those centers are not being well taken care of, and funding isn't necessarily being clearly allocated to those centers. Or for organizations like Women for Change or Sonke or other organizations where we're doing this work, we don't receive funding or partnerships to do this work. So it's like there is the money that is apparently being used, but our implementation is so lacking and our reporting is almost non-existent that it doesn't matter that there's money somewhere. There's no on-the-ground real work that we're seeing.
Now, still on that, UN Women reports that, in 54% of the world countries, including Africa, by the way, rape is still not legally defined by the lack of consent. How can we, as a society or a country or the world, speak of justice in 2026 when the law itself requires a woman to prove physical resistance rather than the absence of yes? So Mary is here now. Let's speak to Mary. Let's hear from Mary. All right, Cameron, I think you're all that we have. We seem to be having serious network issues with the rest.
Completely understand.
So just to reframe the question, UN Women, reports that 54% of the world's countries, including Africa, or many in Africa, rape is still not legally defined by the lack of consent. So if you just say, no, I do not consent, that is not enough. You need to physically resist. So how can we speak of justice in 2026 when the law itself requires a woman to prove resistance physically rather than just saying no?
I think there's a lot of a deeper issue that is at hand, because I want to speak to statistically, even in countries where it is legal, the conviction rates in those countries, like in South Africa, for example, I think it's about 3% conviction rate. So even when it's illegal and it is clearly defined in the law as illegal, women still have to fight to convince and prove that it did happen and that it was as bad as they say it happened, So before you even talk about the legality, you're already on trial. Then in countries where, across the continent where it's not even recognized as legal, particularly marital rape, that's a very big one that I think is a big issue, is it's not considered rape when you're married to this person. What it does is it further emboldens this ideology for men in these relationships, that they own women and that they have every right to decide what happens to their bodies, and it feeds into a culture that believes that women have no autonomy. And I think it's hard to have these conversations, because the unfortunate thing is when we are advocating and pushing to be heard in these spaces, when there's no legality to support what we're saying and what we're fighting for, it's very easy to be dismissive of it. And I think that's very frustrating, and it's why often the work we do, we often have to go to the government, we have to take it to the judicial system, because those are the deciders and the people who have the power to make these changes happen and to force these things to be considered illegal. But it is very scary that it is so prevalent, that there are still so many countries that have not considered rape illegal, and that there has to be criteria to be met.
All right. Now, let's move to the ongoing conflict in Sudan, where we hear that conflict-related sexual violence has reportedly increased by 87% in the last 2 years. How should the international community, what should they do, and how have they failed to classify these systemic atrocities as a primary war tactic rather than just a byproduct of instability? Because there are concerns that the international community doesn't even seem to care about some of these wars and what the women and girls are actually going through in Africa. It's not reported widely.
So this question I think is really interesting, and I'm not an expert necessarily on international crises, but what I will say that I've noticed is that with organizations like the UN, there is an emphasis on what we call the global north, or more Western countries that get prioritized in these dialogues. There's more emphasis on what they are going through. I think the continent, of Africa, we continuously are overlooked in these conversations. I mean, if we think, you mentioned South Sudan, but we think about the Democratic Republic of Congo, where rape is a form of warfare. It is used as a tactic to destroy communities. It is very prevalent. It has been for many years, and we are continuously lacking, that support from international bodies to step in and to infiltrate. And I think it's just indicative of a lack of recognition and care for the continent. And there could be a multitude of reasons as to why this happens, but I consistently see that even reporting wise, even the way that things that are discussed within international bodies, as Africa's issues, collectively lumping the entire continent together, there's really such a minimization of the crises that we face across the continent. And I think it's very upsetting. Again, like I keep saying, it is upsetting because there's so many things happening across the continent to many women who have very little power to do anything to protect themselves, and their communities themselves are the perpetrators at times, and yet we cannot rely even on international support in any way.
All right, let's find out if Mary can actually respond now. Mary, if you can hear me, please just say something. All right, so still coming to you, Cameron. Let's talk about the recent elections in Ghana and Kenya. AI-generated deepfakes were used to target and silence female political candidates, which is really sad, because we're here in Africa saying that women are not given enough, when it comes to politics. They're not given enough quota and all that. But with the AU's new convention on ending violence against women, are there specific digital borders, that must be built to prevent technology from becoming the newest tool of patriarchal repression? Because we also see what happens, on X with Grok. Let's not even go into that, how they strip women and make them look more, naked and all that. But then let's not even go into that. Let's stick to the question of how technology must be used or built to prevent, to become the newest tool of patriarchal repression.
I think similar to the fossil fuels question, I'm definitely not an expert on technology and the systems that are used in place.
But you use the platforms, you use, most of the social media platforms, so you should have an idea, right?
I think I have an idea in terms on a social level, because again, as an organization, our focus is on gender-based violence and not necessarily on the technical structures and systems that are designed with technology. So I can't put insight on that. But what I will say is there is an increased rise in the safety and protection of women. We do already have a crisis on social media and on these platforms of revenge, pornography and distribution of material that has not been consented to. And so to now have AI be a factor to worsen that and to allow people to create content that isn't even real to use against women and as a form of manipulation and often blackmail at times is very scary. And so, like I said, it's not my area of expertise, but I think there's a lot of responsibility needed from platforms, like you mentioned X, but any other kind of platform that exists, whether it's social media or professional platforms, for there to be so much more care taken in implementing protective and safety measures. There's a need for censoring of content. There's a need for filtering content. There's a need of quicker reaction, because something we notice is that social media platforms don't necessarily react quickly to reporting of issues, and that these videos and these pictures tend to circle the web and go very viral, and yet there's no protection given to those people. So I think there's that issue as well. But I also think from a local space as well as countries, it is our responsibility to think of how do we protect our citizens from this kind of digital warfare that seems to be arising with the rise of AI as well.
All right. Let's talk about West and Central Africa, where girls now make up nearly half of all identified trafficking survivors. To what extent is the triple threat of, climate displacement, conflict, and economic collapse creating a permanent pipeline for the exploitation of the African girl child?
I think that's an interesting question. As I mentioned, that's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I can say what speaks to me as you say that is that desperation, that having no other choice and ending up in an environment where people weaponize your desperation and exploit that. And I think with trafficking, often it's simple as looking for just a job to make some kind of income to bring home because the system that you're in is not in any way supporting you or providing opportunities. And people taking advantage of that and exploiting that. And especially for young girls, there isn't any education or information on how to protect themselves. There's no education on what this can look like. The laws and the legal systems aren't necessarily clear cut in exactly what that means. There's a severe lack of implementation when it comes to the protection of these young girls and women, when trying to file reports, when trying to expose these kind of trafficking rings. There's a lot of gaps that exist. And I think, again, it speaks to the fact that there's such a desperation that is needed. And the fact that this can be exploited to the extent that it is terrifying. And I think trafficking is becoming such a prevalent issue. And I think something to notice as well, trafficking isn't always just a random person taking someone. It can be someone it can be your community, it can be a family member, a teacher. It doesn't have to be a random stranger taking you out of your home. And I think if people also realize that trafficking is so much broader than just being, taken from your environment, they would also see how prominent it is. And I think that would also push for more recognition that trafficking is a major crisis across the world, particularly across the continent as well.
We've actually spoken so very well about that because it's usually people closest to you, people that that actually, traffic, them or you. And then you have so many women, especially Nigerians, being trafficked to Libya where they're sold into slavery and they're made to, work as maids and all that. And then you go to Spain where they're sold for prostitution and the likes. It's really, really sad. And then you come to sub-Saharan Africa that still accounts for, 70% of global maternal deaths. A report came out last year where they said that Nigeria is actually the deadliest country to actually give birth. So would you call this a medical failure or is it a political decision to, prioritize hard infrastructure like roads, mines, over the soft infrastructure of primary health care for women?
I definitely think it's a multi-layered issue. I think what we see is a lack of attention being brought to the safety and healthcare of women, which I think comes from multiple places. Recently, we've had studies come out in South Africa of, menstruation products like pads having very dangerous chemicals that may even be causing infertility. And the fact that has been such an issue. And I think what it speaks to is there's a lack of research being done on how to protect women and women's bodies and the consequences that are happening. There's not enough work and investment put into understanding the female body to truly be able to begin to safely now decide on measures to protect them and to take care of them. Then on a medical level, there is often a dismissal of women's experiences. Many women will go to get medical support and medical care and they will be treated as if it is a psychological issue. It's not a real issue. They'll be dismissed. Their pain will be minimized. And so you're not supported successfully when you go to these spaces. And so if you aren't believed or treated as someone who is believable when it comes to your own medical safety, then when you get to these, hospitals or these clinics and you try and get care, they don't treat you as much as you need the care. And I think that's another issue. But if we're looking at the government's role, once again, there is a lack of investment that they have. They aren't investing in the protection of women, like you said, in terms of soft infrastructure. There is a lack of prioritization put on improving healthcare systems to be able to better support women. But it's a multi-layered problem because as much as there can be investment, there is a systemic issue within the medical space that continues to disadvantage women when they do seek out medical care.
Okay, so let's, wrap up and ask you, this year's International Women's Day theme focuses on action, right? So if you had to define a sovereign African woman in 2026, one who is free from the entrapment of, debt, fossil, and fear or whatever challenges that the woman actually facing in this year, what does her daily reality look like?
So I have a bachelor's in psychology, and the first thing that comes to mind is just the lightness of breathing, just waking up calm. I don't think I can explain the physical toll this level of stress and anxiety and trauma creates on someone. And just being able to wake up and not immediately feel that tension, that fear, not immediately jumping to think of a solution for a problem that is already coming, that, already is brewing. I think it's that ability to wake up and feel just peace, and then to go through your day making decisions for yourself, not in contrast to what someone else can do or influence you. Simply deciding what to wear today, where to go today, and not out of fear and worry of what will come. Being able to make a decision to invest in things that you are passionate about and that you are curious about and things that you want to do. We're not allowed to have passions because of this. So that ability to just be, I don't think I can express that enough, to just be oneself and feel at peace. That is what I envision.
All right. Well, thank you so much once again, Cameron Kasambala, spokesperson for Women for Change. It was a pleasure having you speak on this, and happy International Women's Day to you.
Happy International Women's Day.
All right, bye. I would also like to thank Mary Ikoku, founding president, Emerge Women Development Initiative in Abuja, and also Ruqayyatu Imam, president, Medical Women Association of Nigeria, Borno Chapter, who sadly could not join us due to network issues. But we hope to have them again some other time.